Orphans, how did it feel seeing your friend disrespect their parents? When I was 14, my friend who lived with his mom invited me over for a sleepover. I expected him to be respectful, but instead he yelled at her until she cowered. "Dad's death is your fault!" It was after one of their grief counseling sessions. His mom, Lauren, just held him while he sobbed and never brought it up again. By 21, Keith called her drunk at 1 a.m. because his car broke down. When she drove 3 hours to get to him, he just got in and said, "Took you long enough," without saying thanks. I was with Keith when his mom called one day. For the first time, she was asking him for something. "Next Saturday is 8 years since Dad passed. Could you come home for dinner?" Long pause. That night, he texted her, "I'll be there Saturday. 6 p.m., I promise." She showed me her grocery list, told me after 8 years of being strong for him, he was finally going to be there for her. All he had to do was show up. I arrived early to help her cook. She'd already been to the cemetery at 7 a.m. I told him Keith's coming today, that he'd be so proud. Then she brought out photo albums, pictures of Keith's dad. I watched as she talked to them like he was there. "Look, honey, or doesn't make sense is the dad proud of his son eating dinner? I'm making your pot roast. Keith's coming tonight." She held their wedding photo close. She was smiling through tears. "And tonight he's going to be there for me, just like you would have been." At 6 p.m., he still hadn't arrived. She texted, "Keith, are you here? Dinner's ready." He left her undelivered. At 7 p.m., she called for the 10th time. This time he picked up, and the second I heard the background music, my stomach dropped. "Keith?" Her voice was barely there. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" He was yelling over music. "Keith, where are you?" "Oh, I'm at Samuel's place. He's throwing this huge party. It's insane." "Keith, it's 7 p.m. You were supposed to be here at 6. Long pause. The music blared. "Wait. Crap. Was that tonight?" I watched her face shatter. "You texted me this morning. You said see you tonight." "I mean, yeah, but I thought you meant like next weekend or something." "Keith, do a shot!" Someone screamed in the background. "1 second. Mom, I'm sorry. Samuel invited me last minute and it's the anniversary, Keith. The 8-year anniversary of your father's death." "Oh, right. Yeah. Look, Mom, we can do dinner literally any other time. What's the big deal?" She sat there holding the phone even though the line was dead. Looked at his cold plate. "I'm sorry. He didn't come. Our boy didn't come." She was sobbing. "You'd be so disappointed in how I raised him. You would have done a better job." She stood up and walked to the trash and scraped Keith's entire meal into the garbage. Next Sunday, Keith showed up at 5 p.m. like always, on his phone, laughing. "Hey, Mom." He went straight to the fridge, sat down scrolling. Lauren was making spaghetti. She was quiet. "What's for dinner?" "I'm starving." She didn't answer. "Mom, what are we eating?" "Spaghetti." "Cool." She set down her fork. "We need to talk about last Saturday." He shrugged. "Oh yeah, sorry I couldn't make it. That party was crazy though. I met this girl. You promised me you'd be there. And I said I forgot. What do you want me to say?" I apologized. "No, Keith. You chose a party over me." "Okay, and? Mom, I'm a grown man and make my own decisions. It was the 8-year anniversary of your father's death. Dad's been dead for 8 years. At some point, you have to let it go." I couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Keith, are you serious right now?" "Dude, stay out of this. This is between me and my mom. Your mom spent 6 hours cooking. She set up photos. She sat there alone until 9 p.m. waiting. See?" he said to her. "This is what happens when you complain to other people." I didn't complain. He was here. He watched me sit at that table alone. That's when Lauren's hand gripped the counter. Her other hand went to her chest. "Mom?" Keith's voice changed. Her breathing got weird. I jumped up and caught her before she hit the floor. "Call 911!" I yelled at Keith. He just stood there frozen. "Keith!" He fumbled for his phone. She held up a hand to stop him. Took a breath. "Keith." Her voice was so quiet. "I need to tell you something." She gripped his hand. "The doctors gave me 6 months." Keith's face went blank. "What?" "That was 5 months ago. I wanted to be strong for you. One last time." 10 minutes later, she was in the ambulance, and Keith finally said it. "Mom, there's a reason why I never appreciated you." His next words even made the EMTs pause. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. One of the EMTs shifted position to check Lauren's blood pressure, while the other kept his eyes on the road. But I saw them both glance at each other. The silence stretched out while Lauren gripped the metal rail on the gurney, her knuckles going white. We were all waiting for Keith to explain what could possibly justify 8 years of treating his mother like garbage. The ambulance hit a pothole and lurched hard to the left, and Keith's face went from defiant to pale, as he seemed to realize that 2 strangers and his dying mother had just heard him say there was a reason he never appreciated her. He closed his mouth and looked down at his hands. The rest of the ride happened in silence except for the equipment beeping and the siren wailing above us. At the ER entrance, the back doors swung open and the EMTs rolled Lauren inside. I jumped out and followed them through the automatic doors while Keith trailed behind us. A nurse at the intake desk shoved a clipboard at me with a pen attached by a chain, and I started filling out the paperwork while Keith paced back and forth near the vending machines. He had his phone in his hand, but he wasn't actually looking at it, just turning it over and over. Lauren got wheeled into a bay with blue curtains, and I heard a nurse asking her questions about her medical history and current medications. Keith walked over to the curtain but stopped at the edge, hovering there without going all the way in. I watched Lauren turn her head to look for him, and even through her pain I could see her register that he was keeping his distance. Her eyes went from hopeful to resigned in about 2 seconds. The attending physician showed up around midnight, a tired-looking woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun. She reviewed Lauren's chart for what felt like forever, her expression getting grimmer with each page she flipped. She asked to speak with family and gestured for Keith and me to follow her to a small consultation room with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights. She confirmed what Lauren had already told us in the ambulance. Advanced illness, likely cancer progression based on the symptoms and timeline. The 6 months she was given 5 months ago was still accurate, maybe less now depending on how things went. Keith sank into one of the plastic chairs and stared at the floor tiles, counting them or something. The doctor explained that tonight's episode was stress-induced, but the underlying condition was unchanged. There was nothing they could do in the ER except manage her pain and make sure she was stable enough to go home. A woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and a hospital badge came into the waiting area while we sat there processing everything. She introduced herself as Lynn Wallace from the hospice coordination team. She explained she worked with families facing end-of-life care and wanted to offer support services. She could set up a meeting to discuss options for Lauren, talk about what the next few weeks might look like, help coordinate care. Keith immediately said he needed to think about it, that this was all happening too fast. Lynn's expression stayed gentle but firm as she noted that with Lauren's timeline, thinking time was limited. She left her card on the table between us and said to call whenever we were ready, but sooner was better than later. Back in the hospital room at 3 a.m, Lauren looked at Keith from the bed where they'd moved her. She told him quietly that she was given 6 months and 5 months had already passed. Her voice came out steady, but her hands shook as she tried to adjust the blanket. She explained she wanted to be strong for him one last time, to not burden him with her dying while he was still figuring out his life. Keith's face crumpled like paper, and for a second I thought he might actually move closer to her, might take her hand or something. But he stayed frozen in the chair by the door, and I watched the space between them feel like miles, even though the room was tiny. As dawn light started filtering through the hospital blinds, turning everything gray and washed out, Keith finally spoke the words that had been building since the ambulance. He told Lauren he believed she let his dad die by agreeing to the DNR, that she gave up on him when she should have fought harder, that if she had pushed the doctors to do more, to try everything possible, his father would still be here. Lauren didn't argue or try to defend herself. She just closed her eyes and 2 tears slid down her cheeks, leaving wet tracks on her pale skin. The silence after Keith's accusation felt crushing, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I wanted to say something, but nothing seemed right. Lauren opened her eyes after a minute and looked at Keith with an expression I couldn't quite read. She made one simple request. She asked if they could have one honest dinner together, even if it was just hospital bedside before she died. Just one meal where they were both present and not fighting. Keith nodded but wouldn't meet her gaze, and I realized sitting there that he'd given her hundreds of empty promises before this moment. This was just another one to add to the pile. I drove home alone while Keith stayed at the hospital, saying he wanted to sit with his mother for a while. The sun was coming up by the time I got to my apartment, and I spent the morning debating my own boundaries in this situation. I'd watched Keith hurt his mother for years, and I'd made excuses for him, helped smooth things over, been complicit in his behavior by never calling him out directly. Sitting on my couch with cold coffee, I decided I'd help coordinate practical things like rides and paperwork, but I wouldn't enable his avoidance or make excuses for him anymore. If he wanted to waste his mother's last month on Earth being angry and absent, that was his choice to own. Lynn called me the next afternoon because I'd listed myself as a secondary contact on the hospital forms. She scheduled a family meeting for 2 days out to discuss hospice versus continued treatment options. She explained the meeting would cover realistic expectations about Lauren's condition, different care options available, and what the next few weeks might look like practically. I agreed to be there and texted Keith the details. I watched the message sit undelivered for 3 hours before he responded with just okay. That evening, Keith texted that he couldn't make the family meeting because he had a work shift and his friend's birthday dinner. I stared at the message for a long time. Normally, I would have responded with understanding, offered to reschedule the meeting, made it easier for him. Instead, I texted back that his mother was dying and he needed to figure out his priorities. Then I turned off my phone. The next morning, I drove to Lauren's house to check on her and found a woman with gray hair tied back in a ponytail standing on the porch holding a glass casserole dish. She knocked twice and waited, shifting the dish from one hand to the other. Lauren opened the door slowly, still in her robe, and the woman's face went soft with concern. She introduced herself as Penny Costa from 3 houses down and held out the casserole without waiting for Lauren to invite her in. I walked up behind them, and Penny glanced at me, then back at Lauren. She offered to drive Lauren to doctor appointments or the pharmacy, said she had a flexible schedule and it was no trouble at all. Lauren thanked her quietly and took the casserole, and Penny touched her arm gently before leaving. After Penny walked back down the driveway, Lauren carried the casserole to the kitchen, and I followed her inside. She set it on the counter and stared at it for a long moment. I asked if she knew Penny well, and Lauren nodded, explaining Penny had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years and watched Keith grow up. I helped Lauren put the casserole in the fridge, and she sat down at the kitchen table looking exhausted. That's when Penny came back up the porch steps and knocked again. Lauren opened the door and Penny stepped inside this time, closing the door behind her. She pulled me aside in the hallway and spoke quietly so Lauren wouldn't hear. Penny told me Lauren never told anyone how sick she was, just kept showing up to neighborhood potlucks and block parties with a smile until about 2 months ago, when she stopped coming. Penny said she noticed Lauren's car sitting in the driveway for days at a time and the mail piling up, so she started paying closer attention. She explained that Lauren was the type to help everyone else but never ask for help herself, and now Penny was kicking herself for not checking in sooner. Late that night, my phone rang and Keith's name lit up the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. His breathing sounded uneven and I could tell he'd been crying. He asked if I was still awake and I said yes. There was a long pause filled with static and distant traffic noise. Then he told me he wanted to play something for me. Before I could respond, I heard a click, and then a man's voice came through the phone, warm and a little raspy. The voice said Keith's name with so much affection it made my chest tight. It told Keith that he loved him and was so proud of the man he was becoming that he wished he could be there to see Keith graduate and get his first real job and fall in love. The voice said Keith was going to do amazing things and that even though the treatments weren't working, knowing Keith would be okay made everything easier. The recording ended with a soft goodbye, and then Keith's voice came back, broken and shaking. He explained he saved this voicemail 8 years ago, recorded it from his dad's phone the week before he died. Keith said this is why he knows his dad wanted to live, why the DNR was wrong, why his mother gave up too soon. His voice cracked as he talked about listening to this recording hundreds of times, hearing proof that his father wanted more time. I listened to him sob into the phone and realized he'd built his entire blame story on this one piece of evidence, clinging to his dad's love as proof that the DNR was betrayal instead of mercy. I let him cry for a while before I spoke. I told Keith I wasn't covering for him with his mother anymore, that I wouldn't make excuses or smooth things over when he didn't show up. My voice came out harder than I intended, but I didn't soften it. Keith got defensive immediately, saying I didn't understand what it was like to lose a parent, that I couldn't judge him for how he handled his grief. I cut him off and reminded him he was about to lose his second parent, and he was choosing to spend the time being angry instead of present. The line went quiet for several seconds, and I thought he might hang up. Instead, he asked what I wanted him to do, and I told him to show up, to actually be there instead of making promises he wouldn't keep. He said okay in a small voice and ended the call. 2 days later, I sat in Lynn's office with Keith and Lauren for the family meeting. Lynn had a yellow legal pad in front of her, and she started writing a list while she talked. She explained they needed to create a care task schedule with specific responsibilities assigned to specific people. She wrote down medication pickup, meal preparation, appointment transportation, and household maintenance in neat block letters. Lynn looked at Keith and assigned him the medication pickup because it was concrete and time-limited, something he could do weekly without needing to coordinate with anyone else. Keith nodded and said he could handle that, no problem. I watched his eyes dart to his phone on the table and then back to Lynn, and I saw him already thinking about how to delegate it or get someone else to do it. Lynn caught the look too, because she underlined medication pickup twice and told Keith this was his responsibility, not a suggestion. Lauren sat quietly through the whole meeting, her hands folded in her lap, and I noticed she didn't ask Keith for anything directly. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a text from Keith. He wrote that he forgot to pick up Lauren's pain medication and asked if I could grab it since I was probably closer to the pharmacy anyway. I stared at the message for a full minute before typing back a single word. Number. I added that this was his responsibility, and he needed to handle it. The text sat on delivered for 20 minutes before he responded with just a thumbs-up emoji. An hour later, Lauren called me and her voice sounded thin and strained. She asked if I could help her get her medication because she was in pain and Keith wasn't answering his phone. I closed my eyes and explained I was holding Keith accountable, even though it hurt to hear her suffering. Lauren said she understood and hung up quickly. I sat there feeling like garbage, but I didn't text Keith to bail him out. Keith eventually showed up at Lauren's house that evening with the medication. I was there helping with dinner when he walked in and handed her the pharmacy bag. Lauren thanked him and took her pills, then told him the pain wasn't that bad anyway. She could have waited until tomorrow. I watched Keith's face relax with relief as he accepted this easy out. He didn't apologize for being hours late or acknowledge that she'd been in pain all afternoon. Lauren minimized and Keith accepted the minimizing, and I realized this had been their pattern for years. She protected him from consequences, and he let her. The next day, I called Lynn privately and told her what happened. Lynn sighed and said she'd add medication management to her own checklist, that she couldn't rely on Keith for time-sensitive tasks yet. A week later, Lynn called Keith and told him she was referring him to a therapist named Eugene Murphy, who worked with grief and family stuff. Keith agreed to go, but complained to me afterward that he didn't need therapy, he just needed people to understand his perspective. His first session was on a Thursday afternoon, and I drove him there because his car was making a weird noise. Eugene's office was in a small building near the hospital with generic landscape paintings on the walls. Keith came out 40 minutes later looking annoyed and defensive. On the drive back, he told me the session was awkward, that Eugene just sat there and listened without agreeing or disagreeing with anything. Keith said he explained his whole side of things, and Eugene just nodded and scheduled another appointment. I asked what Eugene said, and Keith shrugged, reporting that Eugene mentioned understanding could go both ways. The second session happened the following week, and Keith came out looking angry instead of annoyed. He got in the car and slammed the door harder than necessary. I asked what happened, and he said Eugene talked about black and white thinking, about how his father's DNR might have been more complicated than betrayal. Keith's voice rose as he repeated Eugene's questions about whether a 14-year-old might need someone to blame to feel less powerless. He called it garbage psychology, and said Eugene didn't know what he was talking about. But when I asked if he was going back, Keith said yes, he had another appointment scheduled for next Tuesday. I noticed he kept that appointment in his phone calendar with a reminder set. The following Saturday, I went to Lauren's house to help her organize paperwork for the hospice team. She sat on the couch directing me to different drawers and file folders while I sorted through years of medical bills and insurance documents. In the bottom drawer of her desk, I found a thick blue binder labeled Advanced Care Planning in neat handwriting. I pulled it out and opened it on the desk. Inside were medical documents, legal forms, and a copy of a DNR order dated 8 years ago. My hands went cold as I read the signature line. Keith's father had signed it himself 2 weeks before his death. There were notes in his handwriting in the margins, small and careful. He wrote about not wanting aggressive measures, about quality of life over quantity of time, about protecting his family from watching him suffer through procedures that wouldn't save him. I read every word twice, seeing proof that the DNR was his choice, his decision, not something Lauren forced on him. That evening, Keith came over for dinner, and I waited until Lauren went to lie down before I showed him the binder. I set it on the kitchen table in front of him and opened it to the DNR page. Keith's face went blank as he stared at his father's signature. He picked up the binder and read the notes in the margins, his eyes moving over his dad's handwriting again and again. I watched his expression cycle through denial, then anger, then confusion as he processed what he was seeing. His hands started shaking, and he set the binder down hard on the table. He stood up fast enough that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Keith grabbed his jacket and walked out the front door without saying a word to me or checking on his mother. I heard his car start in the driveway and pull away. I picked up my phone and texted him a photo of the DNR page and the notes in his father's handwriting, making sure he couldn't pretend he didn't see them or claim he misread something in the moment. That night around 11 p.m., I got a call from Lauren's number, but it was the hospice nurse on the line asking me to come over. I drove straight there and found Lauren in bed gripping the sheets, her face tight with pain she'd been hiding all day. The nurse was adjusting her medication pump and checking vitals while explaining that emotional stress makes physical pain worse, that Lauren's body was responding to everything that happened with Keith. After the nurse left, I sat in the chair next to the bed, and Lauren reached for my hand. Her grip was weak, but she held on and whispered that she was so tired of being strong, of protecting Keith from the truth about everything. She said she'd spent 8 years making sure he never had to see how hard things really were, and now she didn't have the energy to keep doing it. I just sat there holding her hand until she fell asleep around 2 a.m., then I crashed on the couch because I didn't want her to wake up alone. The next morning, Penny showed up at 8 a.m. with coffee and breakfast sandwiches, telling me to go home and shower while she sat with Lauren. I ran my errands and came back 3 hours later to find Penny waiting by the front door with her arms crossed. She pulled me into the kitchen and her voice shook as she told me Lauren had been shielding Keith from everything for years. Penny said she'd watched Lauren hide medical bills in drawers when Keith visited, seen her downplay symptoms and cancel doctor appointments so Keith wouldn't worry, heard her make excuses for why she couldn't do things she used to do. Penny's hands were trembling with anger as she described Lauren sitting alone at the cemetery on holidays, while Keith posted party photos online, Lauren crying in her car after Sunday dinners, where Keith barely looked up from his phone. She said Lauren had been carrying the weight of dying completely alone, while Keith lived like nothing was wrong, and Penny was done watching it happen without saying something. Sitting at Lauren's kitchen table after Penny left, I suddenly remembered the first time I saw Lauren cry. It was years ago at Keith's high school graduation, and I'd been sitting in the bleachers with her when they called Keith's name. She'd smiled and clapped, but tears were streaming down her face, and I'd assumed it was simple sadness that his dad wasn't there to see it. But now I understood those tears were exhaustion and loneliness, and the crushing weight of raising a kid alone after loss. Her strength wasn't actually strength, it was survival mode. It was getting through each day because she had no other choice. Every smile at every milestone had been her pushing down her own grief to make space for Keith's, and he'd never once asked if she was okay. My phone buzzed with a text from Keith that just said, "Sorry you're going through this," the kind of non-apology that acknowledged nothing about his own role in any of it. I looked at the message for a long moment and then left it on read, setting my phone face down on the counter. I went back to helping Lauren sort through the pile of insurance paperwork on her desk, focusing on the practical tasks that actually needed doing. 2 days later, Lynn called and proposed something she called a do-over dinner. She explained it calmly, like she was presenting a care plan, saying Lauren deserved to have the anniversary meal she'd planned with people who would actually show up. Lynn suggested doing it at Lauren's bedside with the same pot roast recipe, framing it as a practical goal, one meal together with real presence and attention. She asked if I thought Keith would come, and I said I didn't know, but I'd ask him. When I called Keith, he was quiet for a long time before saying yes, he'd be there. Lynn set the date for 4 days out to give everyone time to prepare and told me she'd handle coordinating with Penny about the cooking. 4 days later, I arrived at 5 p.m. to help set everything up and found Lynn already there arranging a small folding table next to Lauren's bed. Penny had made the pot roast that morning, and the whole house smelled like the dinner Lauren had cooked 2 weeks ago, the one that went into the trash. At exactly 6 p.m., Keith walked through the door, and for once he was on time. He sat down in the chair across from Lauren's bed, and immediately his phone buzzed in his pocket. I watched him reach for it automatically, and Lauren asked him quietly to put it away. He hesitated, his hand still on his phone, and then he pulled it out and set it face down on the table. The small act of compliance looked foreign on him, like he wasn't used to prioritizing what his mother asked for over what he wanted to do. We served the food and sat in awkward silence for a minute, before Lauren said she wanted each of us to share one story about Keith's dad during the meal. The request was simple, but the air immediately went tense because Keith had spent 8 years avoiding talking about his father, except to blame his mother for his death. I jumped in first to break the silence, sharing a memory of his dad teaching us to fish when we were 12, how patient he'd been untangling our lines over and over. I kept it light and warm, focusing on the good parts, and when I finished, Lauren was smiling. Keith sat stiffly in his chair, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, and finally he started talking about a camping trip. His voice was quiet as he described his dad letting him stay up past midnight looking at stars, teaching him constellations, making him feel grown up and important. Halfway through the story, Keith's voice cracked and he had to stop, staring down at his plate. But after a few seconds, he kept going and finished it. I saw something shift in his face as he talked, the first real crack in the armor of blame he'd built, like he was remembering his father as a whole person instead of just a symbol of everything he'd lost. The dinner ended quietly, and Keith helped clean up without being asked, carrying dishes to the kitchen and wrapping leftovers. 3 days later, Keith had his next session with Eugene, and when he came out, he told me they'd talked about something called cognitive reframing. Eugene had asked him to try separating grief from anger, to identify which feeling was which instead of lumping them together. Keith admitted to me in the car that the anger felt safer because grief made him feel like that powerless 14-year-old kid again, the one who couldn't do anything to save his dad. Eugene had apparently told him that made sense, but also challenged him, pointing out that anger was costing him his last chance to actually know his mother before she died. Keith went quiet after that and stared out the window for the rest of the drive home. A week later, Lynn scheduled another meeting, and this time she brought a hospice doctor with her to Lauren's house. The doctor had printed out medical documents about DNR decisions and sat down with all of us to explain what resuscitation would have actually meant for Keith's father 8 years ago. He described broken ribs from chest compressions, the risk of brain damage from oxygen loss, the likelihood of a painful and prolonged death even if the heart restarted. Keith sat at the table listening to every word, and he didn't storm out or argue or defend his old narrative. He just sat there taking in the uncomfortable information, his face pale, his hands clasped together on the table in front of him. When the doctor finished, Keith asked how long his dad would have lived if they'd done everything, and the doctor said maybe hours, maybe a day, but with significant suffering and no chance of recovery. Keith nodded slowly and thanked the doctor for explaining it, and I realized this was the first time he'd actually let himself hear the full truth, instead of clinging to the story he'd built to make sense of his loss. Keith stayed silent for a long moment after the doctor finished explaining the medical reality of his father's death. His hands were still clasped on the table, but his knuckles had gone white from gripping so hard. Then he asked how much pain his dad was in during those last 3 days. The doctor pulled out a chart and walked through pain management protocols, explaining the morphine doses and why they increased them when they did. Keith's face got paler with each detail. He asked if his dad was awake near the end, and the doctor said consciousness came and went, that the body naturally shuts down systems to conserve energy for vital organs. Keith asked what would have happened if they'd done chest compressions, and the doctor described broken ribs, possible punctured lungs, brain damage from oxygen loss. I watched Keith process information that completely destroyed the story he'd been telling himself. His father hadn't been abandoned by his mother. His father had been dying no matter what anyone did. The doctor explained that the DNR wasn't giving up. It was honoring his father's choice to die with dignity instead of trauma. Keith nodded slowly and thanked the doctor in a quiet voice. After the meeting ended and we got back to Lauren's house, Keith went straight to his old bedroom and closed the door. I helped Lauren get settled in the living room, and around 11 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Keith. It was long, several paragraphs. He wrote that he'd spent 8 years blaming his mom, because if someone was at fault, then his dad's death made sense. If his mom had made the wrong choice with the DNR, then there was a clear reason why his dad died, and it could have been prevented. But if nobody was at fault, if his dad just got sick and died, then Keith had to accept that terrible things happen randomly, and he couldn't control them. He said he'd rather be angry at his mom than feel that powerless again. He said he knew it was messed up, but he didn't know how to let go of the anger because it was the only thing that made him feel less helpless. I texted back that understanding why he did it didn't erase 8 years of damage to his mom, but it was somewhere to start. He sent back a thumbs up, and that was it for the night. The next week, Keith showed up at Lauren's house with printed medication schedules and meal plans he'd made. He started telling Lauren when to take her pills and what she should eat for protein intake. The hospice nurse arrived for the daily check and found Keith reorganizing Lauren's pill organizer. The nurse pulled him aside gently and explained that Lauren and the medical team already had a system that was working. Keith's face went red and he mumbled an apology. He backed off immediately, and I watched him learn the difference between helping and trying to control everything. Later that week, I sat down and made a practical schedule with specific tasks. I assigned medication pickup to Keith, grocery shopping to myself, appointment rides to Penny when I wasn't available, and medical coordination to Lynn's team. Keith looked at the schedule and agreed to handle his assigned tasks instead of making vague promises about being there more. The structure seemed to calm him down. He had concrete actions he could take instead of just swimming in guilt and not knowing what to do. One evening, Lauren asked me to help her in the kitchen, and once we were alone, she said she needed to tell me something. She asked me not to try to replace Keith after she was gone, to let him figure out his own life even if he struggled. Her request caught me off guard until I realized she was worried I'd keep enabling him forever, keep swooping in to fix his problems. I promised I'd support him without rescuing him, that I'd hold boundaries even when it got hard. She squeezed my hand and said that was all she wanted to hear. A few days later, Keith called Samuel and told him he was stepping back from parties for a while to focus on family stuff. I only heard Keith's side of the conversation, but apparently Samuel made some joke about Keith being whipped by his mom. Keith's voice went flat, and he said firmly that he was making his own choice, and Samuel needed to respect it. He hung up shortly after and didn't mention it again, but I saw him starting to prioritize differently, even when it cost him socially. At work, Keith requested reduced hours from his manager to help with his mother's care. His manager approved it, but Keith came home looking both relieved and anxious. He told me his paycheck would be smaller, and he was worried about covering his car payment. I watched him make a real sacrifice without expecting Lauren to praise him or accommodate him for it. Lynn helped us file paperwork for family leave resources and arrange for hospice equipment to be delivered to Lauren's home. The process involved endless forms and phone calls and waiting on hold with insurance companies. Keith showed up to every appointment with Lynn and filled out every form himself instead of asking me to do it. These small acts of follow-through mattered more than any grand gesture would have. One afternoon, Lauren sat at the kitchen table writing a letter by hand. She sealed it in an envelope, wrote Keith's name on the front, and gave it to Lynn during her next visit. She explained that the letter told Keith what his father had asked of both of them before he died, about taking care of each other and not letting grief poison their relationship. She said she hoped to tell Keith those words herself, but wanted Lynn to have the letter just in case. Lynn tucked it into her bag carefully and promised to honor Lauren's wishes either way. 2 weeks after the first bedside dinner, we set up another one. This time I put Keith's father's photo on the table next to the pot roast. Nobody made speeches or tried to force deep conversations about feelings. We just ate together and existed in the same space. The quiet felt different from before, less hostile, less tense. Keith passed dishes without being asked, and Lauren smiled when he complimented the food. After we finished eating, Keith helped clear the table and wrap leftovers without anyone prompting him. I stayed to help wash dishes and watched Keith dry each plate carefully before putting it away. The evening ended with all of us still there, still present, still trying. Keith stood up from the table and carried his plate to the sink. He turned back and looked at Lauren sitting in the hospital bed. "Thanks, Mom. Dinner was really good." His voice was quiet but steady. Lauren's eyes filled up fast and she reached for his hand. He took it and she squeezed hard. The moment felt more real than any big speech would have been. I watched them stay like that for maybe 30 seconds before Keith let go and went back to cleaning up. Nobody said anything else, but the air in the room felt different, lighter somehow. Over the next few days, Lauren's breathing got worse and she couldn't walk to the bathroom without help. Lynn called and said we needed to get a hospital bed delivered to the house. The day it arrived, Keith showed up early without me asking him to. The delivery guys set it up in the living room, and we had to move the couch and coffee table to make space. Keith lifted the heavy stuff without complaining. He asked questions about how to raise the bed and lower it, where the controls were, what position would help his mom breathe easier. Penny came over with spare pillows and helped us arrange everything. The house looked completely different with the bed as the center of everything. Lauren's bedroom upstairs became just a place to store her clothes. Keith didn't say anything about losing the living room or how weird it looked. He just kept working until everything was set up right. That night, Keith and I split the hours into shifts, so someone was always with Lauren. I took the early evening and he took the late night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to use the bathroom and found Keith sitting in the chair next to his mom's bed. She was asleep, but he was just sitting there awake. I almost went back to my room, but he saw me and waved me over. I sat on the couch and he started talking in this low voice. He told me about being 14 and watching his dad in the hospital, how the machines beeped all the time and the room smelled like cleaning products and sickness, how his dad's skin looked yellow and his hands were cold. Keith said he kept asking the doctors why they couldn't fix it, why the medicine wasn't working, why his dad kept getting worse. Nobody gave him answers that made sense. He said his mom seemed so calm through all of it, like she accepted it, and that made him so angry. He wanted her to fight and scream and demand they do more. Instead, she just sat there holding his dad's hand and talking quietly. Keith's voice cracked when he said he thought she gave up. I didn't try to explain or defend Lauren. I just let him talk. He went on for maybe 20 minutes about being scared and confused and feeling like the world didn't make sense anymore. When he finally stopped talking, he just sat there looking at his mom sleeping. I went back to bed around 3 a.m. and left him there in the chair. The next morning, I saw Keith's phone on the kitchen counter. He came in for coffee and I watched him pick it up and start scrolling. Then he stopped and opened his messages. He found the group chat with Samuel and his other party friends and held his finger down on it. The option to delete came up and he tapped it. Then he went into his settings and turned off all his social media notifications. He set the phone down and looked at me. "Feels weird," he said. I asked what felt weird. Not knowing what everyone's doing, but also kind of peaceful. He poured his coffee and went back to sit with his mom. A few days later, Lynn set up a joint therapy session at Eugene's office. She said it would help Keith prepare for what was coming. Keith agreed to go and I drove him there. Lauren wanted me there too, so the three of us sat in Eugene's office while he explained what the session would cover. Keith's body language was stiff at first, arms crossed, not making eye contact. But Eugene had this calm way of talking that didn't push. He asked Keith what he was most afraid of and Keith said he didn't know. Eugene waited. The silence stretched out for a while. Finally, Keith said he was afraid of being alone with the grief, of not knowing how to handle it, of falling apart. Eugene nodded and said that was a normal fear. He asked if avoiding the grief had made it easier or harder. Keith thought about it and admitted it made things harder. The session went on for an hour, and by the end, Keith was actually talking instead of just giving short answers. Eugene asked Keith directly why he blamed his mother for so many years. Keith stared at the floor for a long time. Then he said, blaming her was easier than facing how scared and helpless he felt watching his dad die. He said he's still scared of that helplessness, of losing his mom and being alone with all of it. His voice got rough and he had to stop talking for a minute. Eugene told him the fear was real and valid, but avoiding it had cost him 8 years of relationship with his mother. Keith nodded slowly and said he knew that now. Lauren spoke up then. She said she forgave Keith for missing the anniversary dinner. Keith's face changed like he was relieved, but then she kept talking. She said she didn't forgive him for the pattern of cruelty over the years, for the way he treated her, for making her feel worthless. She said forgiveness wasn't automatic. She needed to see sustained effort and changed behavior, not just promises. Keith's face went pale, but he nodded. I understand, he said. Eugene asked if Keith could accept that some damage takes time to repair. Keith said yes. The drive home was quiet, but not tense. The next day, Penny came over with a folder full of paperwork, advanced directive forms, financial documents, power of attorney stuff. Lauren needed to get it all signed and witnessed. Keith sat at the kitchen table with us and didn't try to leave or make jokes to deflect. He read through every page and asked real questions about executor duties and what would happen to the house. Penny witnessed the signatures and notarized everything. The practical preparation seemed to help Keith feel less powerless. He had concrete tasks and clear information instead of just swimming in emotions. Later that week, Penny told us she organized a meal train with the neighbors. Women who had known Lauren for years started showing up with casseroles and offers to sit with her. Mrs. Chen from 2 doors down brought soup. Mrs. Rodriguez brought enough food for 3 days. They didn't make a big deal out of it, just dropped off the food and asked if Lauren needed anything. I watched Lauren accept the help instead of saying she was fine. The community support created this net that held all of us up. One afternoon, Lauren asked for her phone and made some calls. I was in the kitchen, but I could hear her talking. She called 2 women she'd been friends with since Keith was little. She thanked them for helping raise him when she was overwhelmed after her husband died. Keith was in the living room and I saw him stop what he was doing to listen. Lauren's voice carried through the house as she described Keith as a good kid who lost his way. No anger in her voice, just sadness. Keith's face showed he was hearing how she protected his reputation even while he hurt her. When Lauren finished the calls, she looked exhausted but peaceful. Keith came over and adjusted her pillows without being asked. The small gesture felt bigger than it was. That same afternoon, Lynn came by with a cardboard box full of framed photos she'd asked us to gather. We cleared space on the living room side table and started arranging pictures of Keith's dad. There were maybe 15 photos total, spanning from his 20s to the last year of his life. Lynn set them up in a half circle and then stepped back. She suggested we each pick one thing we'd continue doing in his honor, something specific that would keep his memory active instead of just frozen in grief. Keith stared at the photos for a long time before pointing to one of his dad in someone's driveway with tools spread around him. He said his dad used to fix neighbors' broken things, taught Keith how to use every tool in the garage, but Keith hadn't touched most of them in years. He said he'd start doing that again, helping people with repairs. Lauren chose keeping the family recipes alive, the pot roast and the casseroles and the desserts her husband loved. I watched them create these threads of continuity that felt more real than just saying they'd remember him. 2 evenings later, Keith pulled a book off the shelf in the living room, one with a worn cover and dog-eared pages. He asked Lauren if this was still her favorite, and she nodded from the hospice bed. He sat down in the chair next to her and started reading aloud from wherever the bookmark was, just picking up the story midway through. I refilled water glasses and straightened the blankets while his voice filled the room, steady and present. The book was some old novel about a family farm. Nothing exciting, but Lauren's eyes stayed on Keith's face the whole time. He read for maybe 40 minutes without checking his phone once, and when he finally stopped because his voice got tired, Lauren reached for his hand and held it. The simple act of him reading to her felt bigger than any of their difficult conversations, just Keith giving his mother his full attention without needing to fix anything or apologize for anything. Lauren died on a Tuesday morning just after 6. Keith had stayed over in the guest room, and I'd crashed on the couch because Lynn said the signs were pointing to it happening soon. We were all in the room when her breathing started changing, getting shallower and further apart. Lynn held one hand and Keith held the other, and I stood near the foot of the bed with my hand on Lauren's ankle. There were no last words or movie moments where she opened her eyes and said something meaningful. Her chest just rose and fell slower and slower until it stopped rising at all. Keith made a sound like a whimper, and tears ran down his face, but he didn't pull away or leave the room. I put my arm around his shoulders and he leaned into it slightly, still holding his mother's hand. We stayed like that for maybe 10 minutes before Lynn quietly said she needed to make some calls. Keith nodded and finally let go of Lauren's hand, and I watched him look at her face like he was trying to memorize it. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and phone calls. Keith handled the funeral home arrangements without falling apart or avoiding the decisions. We sat at Lauren's kitchen table with forms spread everywhere, picking out a casket and deciding on cremation and figuring out which cemetery plot. The funeral director asked questions about service preferences, and Keith answered them based on what he knew his mother would want, nothing fancy or expensive. I helped him draft the obituary, and Keith insisted on including that she was a devoted mother, even though his voice cracked when he said it. We had to get multiple copies of the death certificate for banks and insurance companies and Social Security. Penny showed up with a list of people to notify, and she started making calls while we handled the legal stuff. The neighbor meal train shifted from bringing food for Lauren to bringing food for Keith, and women kept appearing at the door with casseroles and offers to help clean or organize. The funeral was small, maybe 30 people in the chapel. Keith wore a suit that was probably from his high school graduation, and he stood at the front looking pale but steady. He gave a eulogy that lasted maybe 3 minutes. He talked about how their relationship had been difficult, how he'd spent 8 years being angry and cruel, how he'd blamed his mother for things that weren't her fault. He didn't sugarcoat any of it or try to pretend they'd had some perfect reconciliation. He mentioned the 2 bedside dinners and how his mother had been patient with him even when he didn't deserve it. His voice got rough when he thanked her for not giving up on him, even when he'd given up on her. He said he wished he'd done everything differently, but he was grateful she'd given him the chance to be there at the end. Then he sat down, and Penny squeezed his shoulder and the service continued with some generic readings. 2 weeks after the funeral, Keith kept his appointment with Eugene. I drove him there because he seemed nervous about going to therapy without the immediate crisis. They met for an hour, and when Keith came out, he said Eugene had helped him set up a structure for mourning, weekly check-ins with me, monthly visits to both parents' graves, and continued therapy sessions. Eugene had apparently explained that grief without imminent loss feels different, that Keith needed concrete practices to process everything instead of just drifting. Keith scheduled his next session right there in the waiting room, and I watched him actually write it in his phone calendar. A few days later, Keith told me he wanted to keep living in his mother's house for now. He said selling it immediately felt wrong, like erasing her too fast. We sat at that same kitchen table and talked through the practical stuff. Mortgage payments, utility bills, property taxes, maintenance costs. Keith said he'd need to get a full-time job to cover everything, and I watched him actually think through the numbers instead of just assuming it would work out. I offered to help him set up a budget, but I made it clear I wouldn't bail him out financially if he messed up. He nodded and said he understood, that he needed to handle this himself. Eventually, I went back to my own apartment and my own job. I'd been basically living at Lauren's house for 2 months, and the boundary felt strange after all that intensity. My place seemed too quiet, and my work routine seemed too normal after everything. I called Keith and told him I was available if he needed support, but I wasn't responsible for his choices anymore. He needed to figure out his own path, and I needed to let him do that. He said he got it, that he appreciated everything I'd done, but he knew he had to stand on his own. The conversation felt adult and clear in a way our friendship hadn't been before. Keith started doing the monthly graveside visits he'd committed to. He texted me photos of the flowers he brought, yellow roses for his mom and white ones for his dad. He didn't ask me to come with him, and I didn't offer. This was something he needed to do independently, without an audience to witness his grief or praise him for following through. The photos showed he was keeping his word, showing up every month even when no one was checking on him. 3 months after Lauren died, Keith and I met for coffee at a place near his work. He looked tired but more settled somehow, like he was carrying the weight differently. He told me he'd been journaling about his parents, writing down memories without trying to make them fit a narrative of blame or redemption. He was seeing his mother's choices with more complexity now, understanding that she'd been a real person trying her best, and not just a symbol of everything he'd lost. He said he'd probably always wish he'd done things differently, that the regret was something he'd carry forever. But he was learning to live with it instead of being paralyzed by it, learning to let the regret motivate him to do better going forward, instead of just drowning in shame. A few weeks later, Keith texted me about the grief support group Eugene had recommended. He'd gone to 3 meetings already, and found it helpful to hear other people talk about complicated family stuff. He told me about a woman there whose father died after years of not speaking to each other, and how her regret felt exactly like his own. Hearing someone else describe that same heavy feeling seemed to make Keith feel less alone with it. The group met every Tuesday evening, and Keith kept going without me reminding him or checking up on him. On what would have been the 9-year anniversary of his father's death, Keith texted me and Penny asking if we could come over for dinner that night. When we arrived, the house smelled like pot roast, and I saw Keith had pulled out his mother's recipe card, the one with her handwriting on it. He'd been cooking for hours, and the table was set with his father's photo next to the pot roast, just like Lauren had done. We sat down and ate together, and Keith asked each of us to share a memory of his parents. Penny talked about Lauren bringing her soup when she was sick, and I shared a story about Keith's dad teaching us to change a tire. Keith told us about a camping trip where both his parents stayed up late with him watching for shooting stars. His voice stayed steady the whole time, and the dinner felt like honoring them instead of being haunted by them. After we finished eating, Keith said he wanted to make this an annual thing, cooking the pot roast every year on the anniversary. Penny and I agreed right away. I've watched Keith continue building a life over these past months that includes grief instead of being defined by it. He works his job, goes to therapy every other week, keeps the house maintained, and shows up for the things he commits to. The change isn't dramatic or perfect, but it's real, and it's lasted. When I think about that missed anniversary dinner, I realize it became something else entirely. 2 bedside meals and an honest goodbye that gave them both a different ending than the one that seemed inevitable back when Keith left his mother sitting alone at that table. And that's the whole thing. Nothing too dramatic, just the way it went down. Thanks for keeping me company for a few minutes. See you if you swing by again.